You're listening to a podcast by Great Kids. To learn more about us, visit our website at greatkidsinc.org.
This is Different Eyes, the view from the heart of another, a Great Kids podcast about overcoming bias in others and in ourselves. We'll be talking about how we can learn to see what others see, and vice versa, helping others see what we see. Our discussions will revolve around bias, cognitive bias and implicit bias, and how this all relates to the work that you do to support families. Looking back over the past year has proven interesting in so many ways. One day, our reflections evolved into a discussion of cognitive bias and all the ways that this affects decision-making, ours and everyone else's, without us even realizing it. The conversation got interesting enough that it sparked the idea for this podcast. We hope that by beginning to look through the eyes of others and also helping them to see what we see, we might all start to see things that maybe without each other's help, we never would have noticed. Hi, everybody. Welcome to episode 9 of our podcast series on cognitive bias. This episode, we're changing things up a bit, as promised. And in addition to Shauna Donaldson, the Great Kids CEO, we're excited to add a couple of additional voices to our conversation today. Estela Navarro is the Director of Training and Technical Assistance for Great Kids, and Jennifer Hayes is the Great Kids Product Development Manager, and also, incidentally, one of the primary authors of the Growing Great Kids Next Generation curriculum. Welcome, Jennifer and Estela. Estela, it's great to see you on here with us.
Oh, happy to be here. Thank you.
And Jennifer, beyond excited to know that you're going to join us and add your thoughts to our conversation today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited.
Yeah. So I'm thrilled. I think it's going to be a lot of fun today, all of us being together. And, we're still discussing our different cognitive biases. And today, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the halo effect. Now, remember, cognitive biases are something that we all share. These errors in thinking can sometimes lead to problems in our relationships with others. And they happen because we're trying to process a lot of information quickly. So Dana, would you start us off today by explaining a little bit about what the halo effect is?
Sure. So in this cognitive bias, when we feel a strong liking for one characteristic of someone, just one characteristic, what we tend to do is have an excessively positive opinion of that person's other characteristics. For example, I'm vegan and I love it when I meet someone in the wild who's also vegan. And because I really like the fact that they're vegan, I automatically assign all sorts of other good qualities to them. I even assume right away that I'll like them a lot. And that's not necessarily going to be true, but that's the assumption that I make instantly. Jennifer, you have an example of a time in your life where you've fallen victim to this bias?
Absolutely, Dana. I think about when I encounter people in the business world or even at the bank or other, establishments that I frequent. I notice that I perceive people with glasses as being more serious or maybe ambitious or can help me more than maybe people without glasses. I don't know. But I do tend to gravitate toward people with glasses.
Well, I think that's a good thing coming from somebody with glasses.
Right.
How about you, Shauna? What kind of examples do you have of this?
Well, I love this one. And I was just all over the place as I was thinking about this. I think I automatically fall fall victim, if we want to call it that, to the halo effect when I think about people that work in the medical field or helping professionals, right? I believe they've got pure hearts and they want to be of service and support. So I'm really, I have a really positive opinion of them, just like I do of kids that play soccer, because I have a son that plays soccer. So I think all soccer kids are great kids. So it's prevalent all the time for me. I didn't realize it though.
Right? You don't even think about it. I mean, it's
Right?
just sort of one of those things. And Jennifer, I know you're from Iowa too, but you hear that, and I think I've talked about this in a previous podcast. Just knowing that somebody's from Iowa, I instantaneously assume that there's all kinds of connections there, right? Estela, how about you? Any examples you can think of from your life?
Yeah, for sure. Well, just like you, all of you guys have always been a victim sometimes of the halo effect. Things that I want to share with you is when I was a college student, I remember I tended to gravitate towards other students who were friendly or warm when it comes to work with on projects, right? So in my perception, I view them as dependable, reliable, um, even responsible to work with. And in some cases, that was true. And many other times, it wasn't necessarily the case. While they were friendly and approachable and easy to work with, they were not necessarily responsible or dependable when it came to school projects or deliverables. So it's just a perception, that we form of others, and it's not necessarily, true in so many different aspects of the way that they just come across.
Uh, so it's always kind of a challenge when you get on a group project with people that you think are going to be uber responsible and they end up not being, right? That's not the surprise you want to happen in your world. I think those are all great examples, and I think that starts to make it really clear that we're all victims of this bias. Like, I don't think any of us had any trouble coming up with an example in our lives of when we've suffered from this bias. Um, when we really like one thing about someone, we tend to have just this overly positive opinion about all their other characteristics. So the next question that comes to mind for me is what could possibly go wrong, right? Like, so let's talk for a few minutes about how this bias might cause problems for people. How might this impact our relationships? Shauna?
It's fascinating, right? Because just because I assume that everybody in the helping profession or the medical profession are friendly and outgoing and helpful and smart and all of those things, it's like what Estella said. Sometimes those um, quick judgments don't really pass the muster of that really is what that maybe that provider or whatever really offers. So those snap judgments really leaves out of a lot of what we could know about a person and what they might offer us. And I even think about, myself. I don't want anybody to associate me with something good or something bad and then decide in, the next couple of minutes that I am worthy or good or whatever. So it's just not a fair assessment.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think there are lots of places where this can start to get us into trouble, whether it's work world or in our own personal lives. Estela, how about you? Any thoughts on this particularly?
Well, I think it sets unrealistic expectations in our relationships and interactions with others. And because of that um, effect, we might be losing opportunities in how we interact with others and even address um, some aspects, way of we interacting in ways that would kind of lead us into the next aspect of our relationship, because we might not be seeing some issues or some opportunities. It just, allowed us to, in many different ways, overlook potential issues, I believe.
Yeah, definitely. Jennifer, thoughts?
Yeah, as I was thinking about this particular bias and thinking about people with glasses and how, at the bank that I
Don't
might
change your mind about people with glasses. I want you to keep thinking what you're thinking about people with glasses.
Right, right. Well, I was thinking about, which line would I choose to go in, or, those kinds of things, and missing out on the relationships that I could have formed with people without glasses. And so I thought, wow, this bias can really hinder, me in getting to know other people just based on a quick snap judgment that I have on an
Mhm.
external thing that really I don't even realize I'm doing it, but
Right.
my mind's doing it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
if Jennifer, I love what you just said about what line are you going to stand in, because I had not thought about it that way. So I'm going to start paying attention to what lines am I gravitating towards and try to figure that out, because it could be this halo effect. I hadn't thought about that. So thanks for that example. It's a good
And
one.
and I think, yeah, I think you bring up a great point with that. I mean, the thing about cognitive bias is that it's designed specifically to help us make quick decisions. And, you think about the huge number of decisions that we make during the course of a day. Something as simple as, which line am I going to stand in? Is it just the shortest line? Or are we paying attention to other things? And the likelihood is that we're probably paying attention to a lot of other things they're leading us to the decisions that we make. And I think that probably starts us all thinking about, specifically how this bias might come into play in the home visiting world or in the parenting world. Any thoughts about that? Maybe Estela, you could start us off.
Um, Dana, I can think of so many different aspects of how we as parents or home visitors may become kind of a victim and in many ways impact our relationships with families that we serve. Let me just come from a parent perspective. I believe as parents, sometimes we may, if we have a child who's calm or flexible, we may jump into the conclusion that our child is smart, intelligent, and even socially competent. And while there might be so many areas that, yes, are true in that regard, we as parents might be missing some opportunities to support our child grow in so many different areas because we're not seeing the opportunities inside those behaviors. So great opportunities for us to really um, think about how our overall impressions get in the way of how we think and feel about a character of a person.
Yeah,
And that could be very impactful when it comes to parenting for sure.
yeah, yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely. Jennifer?
Yeah. So, as I was thinking about this, I was thinking about myself as a parent. And when I was parenting, I tended to gravitate toward brands that were organic or good for the environment, in addition to being healthy for, my baby. But I started thinking about how this would relate to home visiting and parenting and my relationship with the family that I was building, trying to build a partnership with. And this kind of bias might make me see parents that do this as well as just inherently good parents, that they want the best for their child, and just based on the kinds of things that they're providing for their child, when in reality that's not the case. It's not about what you've bought for your child, or whether it's organic or good for the environment, those kinds of things.
I think you brought up an interesting point there, and I think this one connects a little bit with a bias that we've talked about previously, the in-group bias. And what you started to say there was, I think, if I heard you correctly, was that when people do similar things to what I did as a parent, I may see them differently as a parent and maybe assess all sorts of good qualities to them because of that, right? And I think that's something we have to consider, is that that's where we really can start to trip things up, and that in-group, out-group, halo horns effect, that kind of approach to things. So I thank you for bringing that up. Shauna, did you have any thoughts particularly about this in the home visiting world?
I think I'll piggyback a little bit on what you're talking about, Dana, is that when I was thinking about this, I thought about what it was like for me as a home visitor, and maybe why I connected maybe with a family more quickly than I did with another family, which meant our relationship developed a little bit differently. And I would have to be conscious of my boundaries as a home visitor in those situations, right? Because I might have more flexibility with scheduling. Or maybe if they needed something from the office where I worked, I might be more willing to drop it off to them, even though I knew we weren't supposed to. We're supposed to treat all families the same. I could find myself maybe trying to think of ways that I could do more. And I wasn't even aware of that's what was happening. I was aware it was my boundaries because of my training, but I wasn't aware of what that influence was. So I think as a home visitor, even as a supervisor, right? It's going back to it's these quick social perceptions we have that's not based on a real assessment. And it can cloud our thinking and our judgment sometimes unfairly.
Right, right. Yeah, and I think, as you were talking about that, I think it's the things that are happening just below the surface of our thinking that are the real problems, the real things that trip us up in our relationships. And we don't even realize that it's happening, making those kinds of assumptions about folks, and really struggling to get ourselves past that. So when we think about these kinds of examples, why might it be important to overcome them? I mean, I think we all get that, but let's talk a little bit more about that. Maybe Jennifer, you could start us off.
Yeah. So when I was growing up, I used to hear the saying, don't judge a book by its cover, because we all have a different story inside. And this bias makes me think of that important adage or advice. And we need to be aware of this bias and overcome it to truly see who people are despite what we see on the outside or our first impression. And we might miss out on some genuine relationships if we don't check our bias and see people for who they are, beyond the surface. And as a society, we also need to overcome this so we aren't buying into brands that promise us things that might not actually be true.
Right.
So at the personal level and at the community social level.
Right. Good point. Really good point. Shauna?
I love the quote, don't judge a book by its cover. I was sharing with Dana that my mom had a saying, and I didn't know what she was doing at the time, but I think she was mitigating my halo effect a little bit. And it was pretty is as pretty does. And she tried to raise me to appreciate, right, that beauty is only what's skin deep. And it's what someone does and their values and their morals and their character that really makes someone lovely to be around, and that makes them pretty, for lack of better words. And so, and I think it's so true, right? It helps us be more cautious. And I think we have to overcome it. And I go back to children. I think about maybe children that, are in schools. And none of us want children to be left out or ignored because of the halo effect. But can that happen? Sure. So I think we all have an obligation to double check ourselves and think about, favoritism, for lack of better words, or the halo effect and how it shows up, to make sure that we are being inclusive and thoughtful and intentional about really seeing who somebody is.
Yeah, I mean, two things that came to mind as you were talking. First, when you were talking about the pretty is as pretty does, that's some of the original research on this was actually done around that very fact, that people that we find the most attractive, we think all sorts of good qualities about them. And I guess really attractive people can get away with a lot. because we've already assumed a lot of things about their character, about what their behavior will be like. And so really stopping to wait and see with people a little bit. And there was another thing I thought while you were talking, and I have no idea what it was now. So we'll just move on. Estela, how about your thoughts?
I think for me, it boils down to this situation where we might lead into unfair treatment, or miss again opportunities, but um, also I guess the big missed opportunity would be the missing of a deepen in a relationship, really getting to know others, and learning to appreciate the different things that come in their character, and not without any generalizations for the one first or two things that got our attention about the first time that we met them. So it's about that opportunities that we offer ourselves for, um, by thinking about what else could I be missing in this relationship that could grow and make us better when we're together.
Yeah. Dana, can I just add to that it also makes me think about the opposite of the halo effect, the
Yeah,
horns
the
effect,
horns. Yeah.
right? And I will admit, ashamedly, that there have been times in my life when that has been true. And after getting to know that person, right, I assumed one thing because of, for whatever reason, right, I had a negative connotation about them or a negative perception in this quick second. And then after a bit of time, I had so much regret because that person was the exact opposite of what I had made up in my mind because of this horns effect, right? It's this, I've made a negative association with somebody that was very unfair.
Yeah, yeah, and that's a good point. Yeah, there is the opposite effect, and we've all kind of been talking on the same page about this idea that we might miss out on something because we don't get to know certain people or the way. And the flip side of that, not necessarily even going into the horns effect, but the fact that those people might miss out on something. We may not give them the same opportunity to do something that they should have because we've made some sort of a snap judgment about them. So yeah, definitely something we've all got to be careful of. I think we all may need to be a little more intentional about overcoming that halo effect. So what are your thoughts about how we might do this, Shauna? Do you have any ideas?
Well, Dana, we've had this conversation for several weeks in a
You're
row.
going to talk about the elephant, aren't you?
I'm going to talk about the elephant, right? And that's what immediately came to mind is I've got to, slow down. The writer has to be able to slow down and ask themselves, why am I forming these opinions? What is that about? You've got to allow time for that concrete thinking, right, to come in without just that gut instinct. So slowing the elephant down.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we've used that one every single time. We've got to slow down. And that's one of the things that we know is that these cognitive bias are the most damaging to us or the most active in our brain when we're in a hurry because we're trying to make these quick decisions with little information to work on. So I think that's always a good one. Estela, how about you? Any thoughts on how we might challenge ourselves to overcome this?
Yeah, I think the practicing of that regular check-in with ourselves, am I being challenged with this cognitive bias? And it's like that ongoing, checking in that we gotta do ourselves, because it's easy to go into this default of, just judging by our first impressions. So it's an ongoing practice. I want to say that it would be beneficial to think about. And like Shauna said, it's about kind of taking a break and saying, what is going on here for me? I think that's a good starting point. And then from there, it's about, just making that intentional commitment to try to see things with a different lens.
Yeah, yeah. And understanding, is always one of those first steps too. Slowing down, but just understanding how this bias impacts all of us and how it affects our relationships, our expectations, and even our work with families in the home visiting field. Jennifer, thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I would echo what Shauna and Estella have already said, challenging your first impression of people. And it reminds me of mindfulness practice. It's being present in the moment and, really tuning into how I'm feeling and what I'm thinking in order to challenge, that halo effect bias. I read some research too that also indicated that it might be helpful to develop two impressions of people.
Yeah.
When you first meet someone, to keep that bias from informing your opinion of them. And then, as you kind of get to know them, you can kind of select which impression really, was the right one. So I thought that was interesting research as well.
Yeah, the idea of creating two different impressions of people that you meet is really intriguing to me. I think this kind of, and I'm going to reference back again, I think we've used this one before, is setting a policy to guide your future self, right? So I think we've talked about that as a strategy in some of our earlier episodes. So I might make a pre-commitment today that from now on, when I meet somebody, I'm going to consider two possible versions of them, right? It's a little trippy in my head right now, but I think it could really prove to be an effective strategy. I think that would cause me to really get to know them before I decide which, I guess, if either version that I've created is the most accurate of this person. So time-wise, I think it's about time for us to wrap this one up, I guess, unless anybody has any final thoughts that they want to share. Anybody have any last minute things that you didn't share that you were thinking about?
Dana, as always, I just love these conversations, and I think there is so much opportunity inside of them for us all to just take a deep breath and think about what can we do to become a better self. And so I just thank you for keeping the door open for us to continually step into this and have great dialogue around it.
I
Yeah.
agree, Shauna. Thank you so much for having us. As we think about overcoming this bias, I think it's the start of these conversations. As you invited me onto this podcast, I started thinking about this particular bias and having conversations with other people who, maybe were not aware of this particular cognitive bias. And that's just a great opportunity for us to overcome it when we know more. And have these conversations. So thank you.
Well, thank you for the invitation. This was great, fun topic to unfold with all of you. I so much appreciated many aspects of our time together, particularly the different samples that we gave, because I think in so many different ways I connected with every single of them. So thank you.
So thanks to all of you for joining in on this conversation with us today. It was fun to hear from everybody and add a few voices to our conversation. Hopefully, all of you out there are listening, that are listening, are doing the same kinds of things that we're doing in between these. I know I find myself, since we started this podcast series, just these really become conversation starters for me, and having conversations with lots of different people about these. And I know I've heard, Jennifer, I've heard you mention talking with your family about them, and just starting to spread the word, letting people really start to investigate this a little bit on their own, because there's things that we're all, it's a part of who we all are. And I think it's an important part of us, for us all to understand. So next week, we'll be continuing our conversation about cognitive bias, and hopefully all of you out there in YouTube land will join us again in a couple of weeks. Again, if you've missed any of the previous episodes and you just want to catch up, you can find them all on the resources page of our website. That's greatkidsinc.org. So thanks again, and we'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.